Hi, this is Misha, and over a year ago we did a video looking at the English, the British Webley series, getting into the infields, both in 455 and 38. And at the tail end of that, we looked a little bit at the Canadian high power. I've always wanted to revisit it, but there was always something else getting in the way. Well, now we're going to do it. There's a lot of backstory to this, though, so this is going to be a very numbers, date-intensive video. Apologies for that. But it's such an interesting story, and it has been told before, but damn it, I want to tell it again, I guess, because I've got some examples here. During World War I, Canada used British revolvers, such as this Webley Mark 6 here. There you go. This is in 455. We've got a nice long barrel. Very, very quintessential World War I gun. They would also acquire some Smith & Wessons and even some Colt automatics, 1911 style, but in 455. Well, after World War I, 38 caliber became more popular in the Commonwealth, slowly replacing 455 guns. Now this is a World War II production Smith & Wesson so-called Victory model. This is a wartime version of the M&P, later to be known as the Model 10. This one is an American one, so it's in 38 special. The Commonwealth one, purchased in very large numbers by England, Canada, Australia, pretty much everyone in the Commonwealth, would have been in 38-200 or 38 Smith & Wesson, whatever you'd like to call it. So revolvers were still very much standard issue in Canada and what they were pretty much wanting to use. However, an interesting thing happened right at the beginning of the war. In 1939, the nationalist Chinese government placed an order with FN in Belgium for 5,000 high-power pistols. Now, the high-power was very new. It had just been released in 1935. So it was quite a cutting-edge pistol. It was single action only, 9mm. It was based on a design from John Moses Browning, a further development of what was used in the 1911. As everyone knows, it used a double-stack magazine, 13 cartridges, 13 plus 1. Some you could even fit 14 in, so 14 plus 1, a very large capacity for that day and time. Well, Browning passed away really before it could get much past the initial prototype, really much out of the drawing stage. So development was taken over by FN Herstal and a design team led by Dudnev Savre. So they would finish it out. They would release it in 1935. Actually, it was originally designed for French military trials. The French would not adopt it, but the Belgians would for their military, and it became vastly popular in World War II. This is because the Nazis invaded the FN factory as they overran Belgium, and they kept it in production for themselves. This also meant, though, that the Chinese order could not be fulfilled. Now, say if in part of the FN ownership and staff went into exile in England, in the UK. This left the Chinese without a pistol, which they needed because they were fighting the Japanese. Also, since the enemy of my enemy is my friend type mentality, the Chinese became de facto allies with England, Canada, America, and so on and so forth. So in 1941, a Chinese delegation was sent to Canada to the John Inglis factory to work out a deal to manufacture Bren guns, Bren light machine guns for them. Now, whereas the Commonwealth Bren would have been in 303, The Chinese needed an 8mm Mauser because that was more or less their standard cartridge. They had a hodgepodge of weapons, so they were at the Inglis factory working on the details for this Bren. While there, they asked if the Inglis could make the high-power pistol. Well, Inglis had never made a pistol before, but they were game. So the Chinese would leave. Not much would happen during 1942 on this project. 1943, though, was quite a busy year. Early on, the Canadian government would approve essentially their version of Lend-Lease, known as the MAB, to send firearms and other supplies to allied nations, including China. So as a result, in April of that year, the Chinese placed an order with Inglis to manufacture 180,000 high powers for them, P-35 high powers. Now, they hadn't actually worked on developing these. However, we do have a lot of people from FN in England, along with SAVE. So what happened at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield, they would reverse engineer high powers. They would actually make 2 prototypes in the summer of that year, and then they would kind of document their progress and, you know, start to make their own blueprints. Now, in the beginning, the FN, the business owners, objected to this fraudulent, you know, copying. This is obviously against owner copyright. And basically, England and Canada told them to piss off. But this wasn't good. They needed their cooperation. It's just not good policy to treat your allies that way, especially when they're kind of down and can't exile. So after a little bit of pushing and shoving from various parties within the UK, Canada, and even from the Chinese themselves who just wanted their damn pistols, in late summer, around August, Inglis acquiesced and went into talks with FN. Later that year, a contract would be signed where FN would obtain some small royalties, and Inglis would agree not to make more than 250,000 high powers, so $250,000. This was also good because it got the FN staff fully on board to help out with creating and refining the blueprints. So, long story short, by the end of 1943, by December, the Inglis factory had a full set of blueprints, drawings, and even 2 prototypes from England sent over. So they knew how to build them. They had been working on the production line, and they were ready to go. Now, during this whole time, while Britain and Canada's standard issue guns were revolvers, they themselves became interested. If Inglis factory is going to make these for China, why not also make some for them? So at the end of that year, an additional order for 50,000 pistols was placed by Britain. So now we have an order from China, and we have an order from Britain getting us to 230,000, so quite close to that limit signed on the contract with FN. So we are ready to go by the end of 1943, rolling into the new year. So after 2 months of pre-production, setting up the lines, in February of 1944, finally, after nearly 3 years, the first Chinese contract high powers were rolling off the assembly line at John Inglis, known as the No.1 Mark 1. It was a standard high power in many regards, complete with shoulder stock, which was an early, very popular thing really before World War II. You see shoulder stocks really falling out of favor during and after that war. This is an original here, Chinese style. We have an adjustable tangent rear sight. Again, very much like the Belgian version. Slotted in the back for the stock. Lanyard group. Black synthetic grips. Standard thumb safety, standard front sight, dovetailed in, standard muzzle in there, 9mm, single action with the ring hammer, slide hold back with release, and of course a 13 round magazine. Very typical gun. So after the first Chinese were ready to go, the next month Inglis had, helps if I put this on right, huh? Inglis had 1,000 ready for the British, and they sent those over. And this would continue throughout the year, but it would be in interesting numbers. Once the Inglis factory was up and running, it would produce very large-scale numbers of these pistols with the stock as you see it here. However, there started to be supply difficulties getting things into China. They were fighting the Japanese for sure, but they were also starting to fight each other. You had nationalists going up against communists more and more, almost to the point they were shooting each other more than they were actually fighting the common enemy of Japan. It was getting hard to get things into China. You had to either fly them over India or get them in via boat. And frankly, pistols were a relatively low priority compared to other war material that was needed at the time. There was just kind of a big, it just wasn't working out, basically. It's kind of sad because after all the time and energy that went in to develop these pistols, they really came too late. Of course, by 1944, the Japanese were very much on the retreat and defense. So in September, the Chinese contract was suspended. At this time, only about 4,000 No.1 Mark 1 pistols had been delivered into China, with another, say, 14,000 at some point in the pipeline, somewhere on their way, because again, it was quite a long distance to get them in. Since they had already been interested, around the same time, Britain would acquire about 6,000 additional pistols from what they'd already been given, and Canada would pick up about 8,500. Now, again, the standard issue gun in both militaries was a revolver, but these were used by special forces, for example, the SAS. In fact, the SAS would use it for much longer than World War II. The OSS would acquire some, basically just, non-standard units. Also at this time, they would do a minor update known as the No.1 Mark 1 Star, where they would redesign the barrel's locking lug. They would go from a basically completely round style to more of a squared off style for better reliability, durability kind of thing. And all of these pistols at this point would still be of this pattern here with the shoulder stock, so-called Chinese pattern, or CH. So the early guns acquired by both Canada and Britain would be of the Chinese pattern, which was really just a copy of one of the options from FN. So moving into 1945, Inglis would produce about 29,000 of these shoulder stocks for the No.1 Mark 1, No.1 Mark 1 Star. And that would pretty much be where that would leave off. However, in February of 1945, this version would be introduced. This is a Inglis No.2 Mark 1 Star. Basically the same gun. But this one was actually made specifically for the Commonwealth, mainly Canada and Britain. We have a fixed rear sight. Still have a ring hammer. No provision for a stock. They did not feel it was necessary. Otherwise, the same. And these, of course, were a little faster and easier to produce because you have fewer parts and fewer machining steps. And would go into production and be acquired in quite large numbers by both Canada and Britain. They would also introduce some changes and updates. They would improve the extractor, the ejector, and also improve the hammer geometry a little bit, just, further refining the design. So they would introduce some more improvements in 1945. Of course, May of that year, the war in Europe would end. And while the war in the Pacific would technically continue on till August, to be honest, by then it was over. Japan no longer had a navy to speak of, and really the only force it had was left in the home islands. As a result, shipments would resume in June to China, with about another 19,000 pistols going over there. Ultimately, about 44,000 high powers would go to China from Inglis. And in September, the last of the guns would be produced, both number 1 and number 2, in Canada. They would roll off the production lines. They'd be tested and boxed up and shipped out to China in November. So by the end of 1945, the last guns were sent over to China. Now, the Commonwealth would continue using these. English had turned out about 60,000 of the number 1s and about 92,000 actually of the number 2s. So even though these were only in production for about 8 months, they made a large number, over 10,000 a month. And in Canada, they would remain in service with all kinds of units. In Britain, as I said, they were used by the SAS. They were also used by paratroopers and other special forces. And essentially, this would have become, in time, the standard issue. In 1954, it was renamed from the number 2 Mark I star to the L9A1 in Britain. And then in 1957, it officially replaced revolvers. It's worth pointing out that the old .45 Webleys were considered obsolete in 1947, but still several won service during Korea. But by 1957, they basically went to the high power as their standard issue gun in Britain. Now, the first generation of British high powers were all these Inglis. They had tens of thousands of them. And as they would wear out, and also as they would need more, they would purchase new factory guns from FN in the 60s and 70s, and even through the 90s. So some of the British L9A1s will be of the Mark II and even Mark III patterns. And as with their other guns, as these would wear out, originally they would have a Parkerized finish from Canada, but as the finish would wear off, or they needed refurbishment, they would receive the classic British Suncorite finish. It's quite interesting. It's a kind of a very durable paint. It's also very toxic. When you put it on, you have to wear protection. And really, these would not be replaced for decades. And the SAS, they would finally get phased out in the late 80s and into the 90s by the SIG P226. And really, today, they're still being phased out in the British military, the British Army. They were replaced a few years ago by the Glock 17 Gen 4, but there's still a few of them hanging on. Basically, they just used them until the point they were falling apart, not unlike what America did with the 1911. The story in Canada isn't that much different. As to what happened to the ones that actually made it in China, some of them were imported into the U.S. as surplus. I'm sure many others were just lost or destroyed during the wars between the nationalists and the communists during the late 40s. And the ones that weren't, I'm sure, were accepted into some type of service with the PLA. It's just a really interesting story of how this gun more or less accidentally came to be, and also how it accidentally became Britain and Canada's first standard issue self-loading pistol. And also to some extent why 9mm became standard in those nations. Of course the Sten and later the Sterling also played a major part. Sorry guys, my hand's got a little cut on it. No, it's not holding open. Oh well. There we go. Neat guns. I really like the military high power style. I've always thought the lanyard ring really added something to these guns. So here we are, the number 1 Mark 1 star and the number 2 Mark 1 star. This one did go into British service because it did go through the FTR. As you can tell, it had Sunkerite and most of it's wearing off because it's a bring back type gun. This one still has its original phosphate type finish. And Inglis high powers do turn up from time to time. They're one of the more common military high powers just because of how many were made and that they were in allied nations with us. Of course, after World War II, FN would restore the production line in Belgium and continue to make the high power really to this day. But I mean, it had large military contracts across the globe and even licensed other manufacturers. So just a small part of the overall high power story, but one I particularly find interesting. Well, I hope this was more of a detailed look than we did earlier. I hope it was appreciated. If you have any questions or comments, we welcome them below. And if you liked the video, please click like. And if you could, please check out our Patreon page. And you can help support the channel if you wish. When I put this on. Quite a jump forward from a revolver to a high capacity pistol, huh? This is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.